are growing in South Korea for a boycott of Japanese goods in response to Tokyo's curbs on the export of high-tech materials to South Korea as a dispute over compensation for forced wartime labor royal ties between the U.S. allies. Well, many worry the ongoing bitterness over the issue could disrupt global supplies of memory chips and smartphones. So what are the lingering impacts on the country's diplomatic ties, and how will the global market react? And where do the U.S. and China stand in light of the spat? Well, to discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Jiang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and also Professor James Ray from California State University, Sacramento. We shall also cross over with Jack Barton, CGTN correspondent in Seoul, and also Terence Terashima, CGTN's correspondent in Tokyo. And that is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Lee Cho-yuan. So talk to us about the impact, first of all. Let me start with you, Professor Ray. These South Korean tech giants like Samsung, SK Hynix, these are companies that import high-tech materials from Japan to make TVs, smartphones, semiconductors. In some categories, over 90% of the tech materials are actually imported from Japan. How detrimental will these restrictions be for these tech giants?
There's no immediate alternative for those Korean companies like Samsung to find alternative chemicals. President Moon said Korea will start working to build their own industry in these, but that would obviously take some time. There might be other countries that can be in place of suppliers, but I think in the short run this will have a serious impact on the business model for Korean high-tech firms.
Yeah, I guess global investors are closely watching this too. And Professor Gong, this could seriously damage the Korean semiconductor industries.
Absolutely. I think Korea, well, I mean, it's not just the damage to the Korean semiconductor industry, it's also probably a blow to the world supply, because Korea represents a very large source of, say, memory chips. You know, Hynix, as you mentioned, and Samsung. These are the two of the three major memory chip manufacturers. So I think by having such a big blow to them, you know, I'm just wondering what would the impact would be to the rest of the downstream industries.
Yeah,
there will be a lot of applications. Yeah,
maybe far-reaching. Like you said, Samsung and SK Hynix, they control over 63% of global memory chip market, actually.
That's right.
And that is according to Korean International Trade Association. So eventually, it's gonna bite into the global supply chain, not just South Korean.
Well, of course, and already some of those companies are facing challenges from Huawei, and in the markets they've been searching for. Samsung and Apple have long been in conflict, and Japan's industry has been slowly being overcome in many industries by Korea. So I think we see those kind of tensions playing out, and it could have a global ripple.
I want to bring in our correspondent, Jack Barton. He is joining us from Seoul. Great to have you with us, first of all, Jack. We were talking about the impacts on South Korean tech giants like Samsung, like SK Hynix. Talk to us about how they are assessing the damages there. What are the reactions you're getting from them?
Well, they're keeping quite tight-lipped about it. We did see them in that meeting the other day with President Moon Jae-in as the government explained its position and the companies aired their concerns. We have been trying to get some sense of how much of a buffer they have. It's not easy to get, but according to reports and officials, you know, they have at least a 1 to 2 month supply of these materials that they can keep going with. And because of the slowdown, the global economic slowdown this year, and the fact that exports have dipped off for South Korea, they have a backlog of things like memory chips and displays, LED and OLED displays, perhaps up to 4 months. So altogether, maybe they've got between 5 to 6 months before they really need to panic about this. And in the meantime, as we just heard, you know, the government trying to roll out hundreds of millions of dollars to try and get some domestic production up and running, but that's going to be very difficult to encourage and find some alternative suppliers. So, you know, there is a little bit of space here. It's not going to hit South Korea and hit global supply chains immediately, but clearly they're deeply concerned, the government calling it an emergency.
A little bit of space here. We should point out that we're also learning that the trade representatives, officials from South Korea and Japan, they are meeting on Friday. We will get to our correspondent in Japan to get the latest on that. But Jack, many South Koreans are also calling for a boycott of Japanese products. on social media. It's also reported that more than 36,000 South Koreans have signed a petition calling on the government to take retaliatory actions against Tokyo. What's South Korea prepared to do in terms of countermeasures? Will it take retaliatory measures?
Very, very unlikely. There was an initial comment from the government that they would consider retaliation, but since then the government has really moved away from that. You know, given the economic slowdown here, the government's revised down its own GDP growth figures to 2.5%, but Standard & Poor's just coming out the other day and saying 2% is far more likely. So a big slowdown. Retaliation against Japan is just going to intensify this trade war. It's going to hurt South Korea even more. It's something the government is really trying to shy away, and it's why we're seeing such a huge diplomatic effort. Of course, the officials meeting, as we heard today, but on top of that, there's ambassadorial level talks in Japan, and also a very senior member of the President's national security team in Washington at the moment, trying to get, well, we've heard successfully, the US into three-way trilateral talks with Japan to try and resolve this issue. No response yet, none that we know of from Japan as to whether they're interested in that. But you know, that's really the direction the government's trying to push in. It doesn't, you know, the government's even said it doesn't want an emotional response. We've seen that from the public, because this is a legacy issue, of course. The belief is this is retaliation for the court agreeing that Japanese firms should pay compensation to people in forced labor during the colonial era occupation, though Japanese officials now talking about, you know, this is sending products to the DPRK or other trade. It's getting very confusing, all the messages we're getting out of Tokyo. But what we're seeing an emotional public response, but the government's still trying to be very cool-headed about this.
What do you think Japan wants to get out of this? What does it want to achieve by doing so? Because a lot of people are comparing Shinzo Abe to Donald Trump in using sanctions to secure diplomatic win. I mean, how are South Koreans understanding this, and will South Korea answer to their demand?
Yeah, definitely. The perception here, if you look at the media, is this is an emulation of Trump. This is foreign policy through tariffs or trade action, and that's why South Korea is going also to the World Trade Organization, though Japan's saying this is a national security issue. It bypasses that, but there is definitely a big sense of that. There is also a sense here that there are upper house elections coming up in Japan, you know, not so far away, less than 2 weeks away, and this could be Shinzo Abe appearing hardline, appearing conservative to his base, to try and sort of drum up support ahead of those elections. Now, whether that is real or that is just a perception, that is certainly what we're seeing in the media. It's what we're hearing from analysts here, and certainly the hope is after those elections have passed, perhaps maybe these won't be retracted, but we won't see this expanding into a bigger trade dispute.
Right. And Professor Ray, how do you look at this? The concern here is that Japan may not get what it really wants, concessions on wartime labor issue. Instead, it could force Seoul to take a even harder stance. I mean, is Japan to fight for a long-term war?
Well, Japan sort of launched the first strike here, but I think they really strongly in foreign policy do not want to relitigate the colonial occupation or World War II history, and I think they want to send a clear message that they consider their agreements of 1965 to reestablish relations and investment, ending claims that Korean companies, which even have lodged the courts have said they could take assets of Japanese companies. So I think it's really a foreign policy move. I don't think Shinzo Abe faces a lot of domestic political challenge. I don't think he is really calculating how it's going to play domestically. But I think President Moon is in a little bit more political jeopardy if he sort of caves in. I think he needs to really stand up for the Korean public in this dispute. So certainly the politics is very apparent now after the trade dispute begins.
In terms of how much this is playing into domestic politics, Professor Gung, do you agree with Professor Ray? How much of it do you think this is Shinzo Abe posturing to his voters?
Well, I think both leaders are playing to this political game. Ultimately, it's a political game. I mean, President Moon make a fame out of making these claims representing people who are hurt during the colonial days, and now it is his time to show that he really means what he said during the campaign. On the other hand, Shinzo Abe has the same thing. Is the election coming in, and clearly he's sort of flexing muscle to his neighbor and in front of the Japanese voters. And you know, I think, but to be honest with you, I think ultimately it won't drag for too long. They will find a solution. I think both sides understand that, you know, they have to control this. They cannot allow this to snowball out of control. And it's just a, you know, give and take, sort of bluffing before negotiation, and ultimately they're going to negotiate. They're going to negotiate out a solution.
Once the election is out of way, do you think that these restrictions will automatically go?
I think they're going to negotiate. They're going to come up with some kind of a solution, so some kind of in the middle ground. I mean, we're really talking about money here, right? I mean, and I don't think it's a lot of money actually. But you know, from Japanese side, they view this as a principle, as you said. You know, this is something we've already settled with the government. But the Korean side also have an argument here that, you know, this is a settlement between the government. But look at these poor people, right? And these people are going to, you know, not going to have many days on earth ahead of them, and they need to be compensated. I mean, I also want to point out that the same situation also applies to these comfort women. I mean, there's certain a large amount of similarity here, and there are still people here in China having the same kind of situation, right? So, you know, I think Japanese government should really take not so much from a legal perspective, not taking a legalistic perspective, but just from a humanitarian perspective, you know, do something about this. I mean, you can still work around this kind of a legal argument while still doing something to sort of compensate in a way these people who are being hurt
the South Koreans, they are not happy about the settlements. Let me put that to our Jack Barton. Jack, you have been based in South Korea for quite some time. I mean, how are South Koreans looking at the historic differences, the wartime past between South Korea and Japan? What is the sense you're getting there?
In general, if you talk to a lot of people, most people are sort of happy to put the past in the past, but the vocal minority who really are still outraged by a lot of the legacy issues, not just the forced labor in mines and factories during the war, during the entire colonial occupation, but also the comfort women, you know, the forced sex slavery during the war. These are still big issues. We see protests. Now, the numbers aren't huge, but it's very vocal. It doesn't go away. And again, President Moon, he hasn't sort of stepped in to push this, but he's stepped back and he hasn't really got involved. Now, what they're saying now, of course, in terms of this forced labor issue, this is the court. So the government stands separate from the court. There's an independence between the state and the judiciary, so there's nothing that they can do about it. But, you know, it is fair to say that President Moon encouraged this after becoming president and sort of brought these issues up, said they needed to be re-aired, said the agreement struck between the previous the previous government over the comfort women issue, that needed to be revisited. A lot of these things caused a lot of anger in Tokyo, but up until now we've seen them keep diplomacy and the economic sort of, you know, business as usual on one side and a diplomatic row on the other. This is really the first time in a while we've seen them converge, and it's not business as usual anymore. Economic tool is being used as sort of diplomatic leverage.
And let's also talk about the impact on Japan. I mean, Professor Ray, Japan suppliers will also take a hit from losing a major export market, won't they?
Well, it is very parallel to the United States, where there's a short-term cost to the trade pressures on rival countries, but the long term is going to come back to harm Japan. I mean, it's a country with a dramatically aging population, losing global competitiveness, losing market share, obviously to China's second largest economy. But Korea is really an economic competitor with Japan. And so I think they are facing all sorts of insecurities economically. And this is, you know, a risk. And likewise, if Korea allows these kind of legal processes to go forward, they could happen in China, Philippines. There's a host of countries that suffered the same fate in World War II. So I think it is very unusual, because Japan usually does things very quietly to kind of launch this broadside and then say we will not change our mind, and they've taken a fairly hard line against, you know, a country that's in partnership with the U.S.
Yeah, but very unusual maneuver. Professor Gong, what are the possibilities that these restrictions will make Japan eventually lose the grip on a vital link on the global supply chain and eventually harm itself?
Well, I mean, Japan is at one point is a very large trading nation, still one of the largest trading nations in the world. I mean, the country's economy is built on having trade with other countries. Now, I think there's a danger. I mean, this thing was started by the United States government, actually, right? right? Just cutting off major components and parts supply, and now everybody just go back to their drawing boards and look. We have to make sure that our vital supply cannot be cut off by someone. So everybody's going to go back and develop their own solution and be just and target this. So I think this is the danger here, that the beautiful story of global value chain has been so successful in Northeast Asia, across the Pacific, across the Northern Pacific. This huge trading network has been driving, the economic prosperity here in Asia, the lifting of people out of poverty. This whole phenomenon is coming to an end, I'm afraid, that everybody is going to go back and do their own thing. And this, I think, trade probably is the biggest victim here. It's probably bigger than just Japan and South Korea. From this day forward, I think everybody's going to worry about this question. What will happen if I'm cut off by this country, right? So trade is now, in a sense, sort of embroiled in this political game now.
And there's also the element of the DPRK here. I mean, in terms of why Japan has decided to slap on these restrictions, the Japanese media report quoted a senior member of Abe's Liberal Democratic Party as saying some of the high-tech materials, hydrogen fluoride, exported to South Korea eventually ended up in the DPRK, which the country may use them to develop their nuclear and missile programs. I mean, how do you look at this kind of allegation, truth or tale?
I don't think there's much truth to it, my suspicion, and I think it's a political maneuver by Japan to use the national security issue, if there's a WTO claim, to say they have the right to return Korea back to the traditional standard on these export controls. But earlier today, I think someone in the South Korean government said they would like to have an international investigation about these North Korean claims, which suggests they're pretty confident there is no North Korea link. And if they go forward, unlike Jack said, in a more positive way, if they go in a more confrontational way, I think South Korea might push stronger on that issue, because in the WTO, Japan doesn't have a strong claim for these approaches.
And Jack, what have you learned on the case? How has South Korea responded to the allegation from Japan that these materials, high-tech materials, ended up in the DPRK?
Yeah, that's right. It's not just Japanese media as well. Actually, interestingly, some South Korean media have also reported that that was the case. But the government essentially saying that it's absolute nonsense, calling on the United Nations to launch an independent investigation into Japan's claims, or another international independent body, to try and get to the bottom of all of this. And what the government says is, if it's proven they did this, that they will fully apologize for all wrongdoing. But if Japan is proven to be making false allegations, it should be doing the apologizing. So yeah, as we just heard there, South Korean government seems pretty confident that they seem to feel that this is not true, and if there is a thorough investigation, that Japan's claims will be disproven.
And another player, U.S., may come into the picture, because America's new senior diplomat for East Asia, David Stilwell, will visit both countries, Japan and South Korea, on his first trip to the region this month. So how do you think the U.S. can help settle the dispute between, well, the two allies of itself?
Well, of course, the U.S. is a partner of both countries, but I think President Trump and Prime Minister Abe have developed a very close rapport. And when invited by South Korea to participate, the U.S. demurred and said it doesn't want to be part of this process. And Japan said strongly they don't want the United States to be part of that process. So I'm sure it is a potential diplomatic voice to bring sides together, but I don't think the U.S. will play much of a role here.
Jack, what do you think? Does South Korea want U.S. to play a role here?
Yeah, absolutely. A senior official from the President's national security team is in Washington today talking to U.S. officials about this. Now, according to the government here, the U.S. has agreed to some sort of trilateral meeting with South Korea and Japan. Still too early to get some feedback from Japan, but it's true. You do get a sense with Trump at the reins, there is not a real willingness, particularly since it is very true, as we just heard, that he seems to have a very good partnership with Shinzo Abe. Having said that, this is going to have a big impact on global supply chains. That means the United States as well. South Korea, by far the biggest memory chip supplier in the world. It's going to hit Japan as well, of course, very hard somewhere down the track. So there's the political view here, but at the end of the day, there's the business view as well. This is going to have an impact on American trade, and if this isn't resolved at some point, that is a reality. It's not an if, it's a when it's going to happen. That must also be playing on the minds of officials in the White House, including President Trump, even if he's reluctant to get involved in this.
And we would very much like to get a Japanese perspective on this, but unfortunately we're experiencing a technical glitch with our connection with Terence Terashima, who is based in Tokyo. But let's now talk about China's role in it, because Bloomberg has pointed out that this dispute between Japan and South Korea may somehow play into China's hands. Do you agree with that, Professor?
Absolutely. I think in general, China likes to have a good relationship between South Korea and Japan. We have to also remember that China is in the midst of pushing for China, Japan, and South Korea regional trade agreement. There's a trilateral trade agreement currently under discussion by the three countries. Now, China already has a free trade agreement with South Korea, and I don't think there's any problem with China establishing a trade agreement with Japan. I think the trilateral FTA, the biggest stumbling block right now is indeed actually between Japan and South Korea. So I think from that perspective, it's kind of regrettable to see that this prospect seems to be sort of falling apart right now. But on the other hand, I think China is also concerned from a sort of more narrow, more mundane sort of economic interest perspective. That is because China is the largest manufacturer of all sorts of consumer electronics devices, and all of them pretty much they all use memory chips. And with this, the two Korean companies being cut off, and it's going to have a huge impact. I'm pretty sure the memory chip price is going to shoot up the roof. And this one American company is very happy about it. That's Micron Technology. It's probably very happy about it. But anyway, in any case, China, even just from an economics perspective, they don't want to see these two countries embroiled in this kind of dispute for too long, because it's indeed going to impact the global value chain. And the global value chain is not just between it's not just about bilateral relations between countries, it's about all of these countries involved in Northeast Asia, Taiwan, China, South Korea. We all work together to make things to sell to the world, and just this piece being missing at the table is going to have a huge impact on all of us, on the rest of us.
Professor Ray, your thoughts on this? How will this affect the trilateral cooperation between China, South Korea, and Japan? How it's going to influence, indeed, on the FTA between China and Japan, or the three neighbors?
I think anything that puts a wedge between Korea and Japan is beneficial to China. A few years ago, the U.S. was trying to build sort of a trilateral strategic relationship between Japan, South Korea, and the United States, the THAAD missile defense system in South Korea, all things that cause concern in China. South Korea has become very warm with China. Chinese students come to study Korean students study in China. There's a burgeoning relationship there. China is really the engine of the region. Japan is, kind of the odd country out. And I think because of the U.S. hostility to the defense relationships and the cost with Japan and South Korea, it's questionable whether the U.S. will be the kind of driving player. And Korea, I think, has historically had, better relations in these issues. Also are shared by China. So I think China's in a better position strategically and economically.
I beg to disagree a little bit with this idea of driving a wedge between South Korea and Japan. I don't think there's much of a really benefits gaining from this, because I think China's foreign policy perspective is generally geared towards building a sort of a community of shared future. And I think there's really common economic and also political interests of getting along with the three most important Northeast Asia countries, because we're all economically we're all intertwined together, and also some human exchanges. So I think I wouldn't necessarily buy into the theory that China wants to see a relationship between Japan and South Korea to deteriorate, actually. I think in general, we would like to see that we have a peaceful relationship, with a healthy, thriving relationship, both politically as well as economically.
And some expert has pointed out that East Asian geopolitics has been shaken loose and is now unsettled. South Korea and Japan were recently engaged, well, not too long ago, engaged in a military dispute. That happened On December 20th, there was an encounter between a Japanese plane, which Tokyo said was collecting intelligence, and a South Korean destroyer, which Seoul said was on a humanitarian mission. So analysts say this kind of tension could really damage the geopolitical situation in the area. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I'll pivot to say I agree with Professor Gong that I think China wants to build East Asian cooperation and use the regional forums to build positive relations. But I think in a way China wins in either scenario. If Japan and Korea have a faltering, if the United States and Japan relationship falters, that serves China's interests. It's not driving that. But if the relationship is good, it also drives China's commercial interests in building markets, in building the supply chains. So I think China's really well positioned in both outcomes, but is working really hard on the regional cooperation and trying, as we saw last week at the G20, to bring Japan into closer cooperative relations with China and in the trilateral relationship with the East Asian Summit and the ASEAN Plus 3.
Yeah. And in terms of what could happen next, some has proposed a solution saying that they can somehow shift its production base, South Korea meaning, shift their production base to other places, for example, Taiwan as a destination. Do you think that's possible?
Well, I mean, partially labor costs are going up in Korea, so like in Japan, they moved their production to Southeast Asia, well, originally to Korea and to Taiwan and then to Southeast Asia. I think ultimately that will be a dilemma faced by Korea as well. Taiwan obviously has the modern semiconductor industries and the capacity to work cooperatively, and there's a good relationship there.
But there may be problems with this. Japanese companies might not want to supply materials that will eventually end up in South Korean companies.
I think Japanese companies still hold some key technologies. Even though their sales revenues may not be very large, but it's very critical sort of niche markets. These Japanese companies are doing very well, actually, very deeply entrenched, technologically highly advanced, I think that situation is going to last for a while. So this value chain is still very important, vital for the South Korean companies. Wherever they go, they have to face these Japanese companies. It's not going to avoid it. So I think, if you ask me my prediction about what's going to happen, I think eventually they're going to work out some solution. It's just we're not talking about real sort of, in my opinion, not vital national interest here. We're just talking about something related to money, right? I mean, it's something that the Japanese government, I keep saying this, Japanese government can still do by still providing some kind of a solution without really hurting its own political base, hurting sort of its image internationally. There's a way to get around this.
Do you agree with that? How the dispute will evolve over the next
I'm not a professor of economics, professor of politics, so I see more challenges on the horizon, again, with competitiveness.
Disagreement?
A little bit. I just think Korea's been a very dynamic economy. I think Korean firms will be competing with Chinese firms and Japanese firms, but I think I'm a little more skeptical of the long-term viability of Japan with Korean hiring practices, and I'm thinking the strategic relationships are so in doubt, as you asked earlier, with the U.S. reaching out to Kim Jong-un and the North Korean situation. It's so fluid and really raising concerns for Japan if they're kind of left out in the cold as South Korea tries to restart those ties to North Korea.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you very much, Professor Gon and Professor Ray. Unfortunately, we didn't get the chance to reach our Terence Terashima due to a technical problem. But thank you all the time for Jack Barton joining us from South Korea and our viewers for watching us. That does it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. Bye for now.